Close your eyes and imagine yourself thousands of years ago in that fertile, mud-scented plain stretching across what is now Iraq, Syria, and parts of Turkey. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were both the veins and the memory of this land. Every year, in a cycle attuned to the changing seasons but also possessing its own will, they would flood, recede, and flood again. These floods were the most defining rhythm that shaped the lives of the people here. If you had lived in that era, this rhythm would have been your year's calendar, the measure of time, and the uncertainty of the future. For the people of that time, time was not measured by clocks or dates printed on calendars as it is today. Time was determined by the slow procession of star clusters in the sky, the rising and setting of the sun on the horizon, the moon's transformation from a thin crescent to a full orb. But alongside these, perhaps the most reliable indicator of time was the river's behavior. Every year, as spring approached, news of melting snows from the mountains and northern rainfall would arrive weeks later, with the rising waters reaching these lands. The memory of the river floods was measured not only by the bounty the water brought, but also by the devastation it caused. If you were a farmer in that period, you would await the rising waters each year with both hope and apprehension. If too much water came, your home, your granary, could be damaged. If too little water came, your fields would dry up, and your harvest would dwindle. For this reason, the severity of each year's flood was etched into memory and passed down orally from generation to generation. The village elders would preserve knowledge of the past with phrases like, "That year the waters rose so high that the roots of the date palms drowned," or "Last year the flood came early and the barley did well." These words were not Jew. With the invention of writing, these observations and flood records began to be inscribed on clay tablets. Especially in Sumerian cities, the height, duration, and effects of each year's flood were recorded. Sentences like, "In the third month, the flood lasted 2 weeks, and salt accumulated in the fields," were not only a description of that year's situation, but also a warning left for future generations. Thus, the memory of the rivers was added to the memory of the people. But in your daily life, more important than the meaning of these records was the cool mud you felt on the earth after the flood. This mud was a sign that the earth was reborn. In the days the water receded, a silence would fall over the village. Everyone would go to their own fields to check for damage. When a year was bountiful, barley and wheat would be piled high in granaries, and surplus produce was sent to neighboring villages or cities for trade. The flood cycle shaped not only agriculture but also social life. During high water periods, transportation became difficult and villages were isolated from each other. In some places, small boats were built and fish were caught on the water. The floodwaters sometimes postponed weddings, sometimes market days. You had grown accustomed to this wait. There was no use in being impatient during flood season. Understanding the language of the rivers meant survival, but this language sometimes told a difficult-to-understand story. There was an old tale the elders told. Once, the waters rose so high that all villages and fields remained submerged for days, and people had to flee to high ground. These stories seemed like fairy tales when you were a child, but as you grew older, you'd realize these tales were actually warnings, because the river held a very ancient story in its memory. Every year by flooding, it gave you life, but it could also one day. The memory of the water shaped the plans not only of villages, but also of cities. Cities like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash flourished on the banks of rivers because water was the lifeblood of transportation and agriculture. But even these cities had developed systems against the risk of floods. Irrigation canals were designed to divert floodwater to the fields. These canals also protected the city center by redirecting excess water to other branches. As a villager, even if you didn't know the engineering details, you would see the canals being redirected and the levees being repaired. This entire order was maintained through both cooperation and belief. Everyone had a task in the communal work done before and after the flood. Men cleaned the canals, women organized the homes after the flood, and children collected fish and small crustaceans. This division of labor was essential to meet the village's survival needs, but the flood cycle was not just a physical matter. This event also held a deep place in people's spiritual world. Rivers were seen as gifts from the gods. The Euphrates and Tigris not only brought water, but also carried the spirit of the gods. Every year, before and after the flood, offerings were made in the temple, and prayers were said for the water to be bountiful. You too would participate in these ceremonies, inhaling the scent of incense burned in front of the temple. Temple priests would try to predict when the flood would come. They compared observed sky signs with records from past years, sometimes interpreting lunar eclipses, sometimes bird migrations as signs, but they were not always infallible. When they erred, the villagers experienced both disappointment and fear, for the flood was unpredictable, and this uncertainty remained a silent anxiety in everyone's mind. Sometimes, after a flood, field boundaries would shift. The waters would erode. Over time, the flood cycle itself began to function like a calendar. People created time periods such as before the flood and after the flood. The birth of children, marriages, even the days for going to the market were determined according to this cycle. You too would plan your life according to this rhythm. Before the flood, the list of tasks would lengthen: house repairs, seed preparation, granary checks. After the flood was the time for harvest, storage, and celebration. As you savored the bounty after the flood, a different kind of silence would slowly settle over the village. The fields had been planted, the canals cleaned, the houses repaired. When their tasks diminished, people would sit by the river, watching the water flow. You too would blend into this silence, enjoying the post-flood tranquility. But this calm was only on the surface. Deep down, the same question lingered in everyone's mind. What will happen next year? Because the flood cycle was never entirely predictable. One year, the waters could bring bounty, the next, devastation. For this reason, every family in the village had to prepare for both abundance and scarcity. During times of plenty, excess grain was dried, placed into large clay jars, and their lids sealed with mud to prevent air exposure. These jars were usually stored in the coolest corners of the houses. If a year of scarcity came, these stocks would be the key to survival. You too would carefully separate the barley and wheat you harvested after the flood, saving them for both winter and potentially lean years. In years of plenty, not only grain, but also fish would be abundant. Water pools left behind after the flood were teeming with fish. Women and children would catch fish in these pools, laying them out in the sun to dry. Dried fish could be stored for months without spoiling. Some years these fish stocks became. Among the offerings presented to the gods during these ceremonies were barley, dates, fish, and sometimes even baked bread. You too would participate in these ceremonies, walking barefoot on the stone floor of the temple, inhaling the smoke of the incense. In the silent moments of the ceremony, like everyone else, you would remember that water could bring both life and death. However, within this order, there was always a slight unease, because people knew that the river's memory was longer than man's. Human memory could only go back a few generations, but the river carried the story of thousands of years, and some of these stories were filled with forgotten disasters. The village elders would occasionally speak of these calamities. Once, they would say, the waters rose so high that entire villages were destroyed. As you listened to these stories, you would question whether they were merely tales. Sometimes, in fields excavated after a flood, old house foundations, broken pottery or stone tools would emerge from beneath the soil. These findings were silent witnesses to the stories of the people who once lived there. Who knows? Perhaps they too had trusted the rhythm of the rivers, just like you. But one day, the river had reopened one of the darkest pages of its memory, sweeping everything away. This thought would cast a thin shadow over the post-flood tranquility. As you sat by the river, watching the reflection on the water's surface, the same question would always arise in your mind. What if this order is broken one day? That question would remain unanswered. For the river did not speak, it only flowed. Your task was to try to understand its language, to be able to read its memory. But when the river would tell which story was beyond anyone's control, and perhaps that's why the post-flood calm, instead of bringing comfort, left a deep sense of awareness. Pottery in the city was not exclusively men's work. Women played an important role, especially in making small vessels and decorative items. Some would inscribe delicate geometric patterns on the clay surface, while others would mark the owners of the vessels with simple seals. These seals not only indicated ownership, but also served as a trust element in trade. When you bought a vessel, you would recognize the seal on it and know whose hands it had come from. The potters of Shuruppak produced not only for their own city, but also for surrounding villages and even distant cities. Thanks to river transport, these vessels reached Uruk, Lagash, and sometimes even Mari in the north. Trade routes stretched along the rivers, and pottery was exchanged for other goods: copper, stone beads, fine textiles. You too would witness these exchanges on market days, curiously examining the languages, clothes, and goods brought by people from different cities. However, behind Shurupak's vibrancy lay a silent fragility. The city was founded in the midst of the river's bounty, but this also meant it was vulnerable to floods. The city walls served as a barrier more against floods than military attacks. During every flood season, the lower parts of the walls were strengthened and drainage channels were cleaned. You too would participate in these tasks, leaving your potter's workshop to work with a pickaxe and shovel at the canal head. Because if the water was not controlled, there would be no one left to buy your pottery. There were stories circulating among the elders in the city. These stories spoke of a great flood that had occurred in the past. When the waters came, they would say, sky and earth mingled, neither houses nor fields remained, everything was submerged for days. While these stories seemed like exaggerated tales to the young, for the elders they were a warning. Pre-flood bartering was seen as virtually the last trading opportunity of the year. Farmers from the villages would bring the last remaining products of their harvest: baskets of dates, sacks of barley, dried fish. In return, they would receive pottery produced in Shuruppak, metal tools, woven fabrics. You, too, would see familiar faces in the market crowd and sometimes hear the different dialects of strangers from distant villages. For potters, the most important orders during this period were large grain jars, because after the flood it was essential to safely store food stocks. Large jars had narrow mouths and wide bodies. This way, the grain stored inside would not spoil easily and would be airtight. The lids of the pots were sealed with a mixture of mud and reeds. The seal not only showed that the lid had not been opened, but also indicated who owned it. As you pressed your own seal, you would know that it was not just a mark, but a kind of guarantee. Another pre-flood hustle and bustle could be felt in the streets of Shuruppak, the cleaning of the canals. The city had a complex network of canals to divert floodwater. If these canals were not maintained, the water could flow in the wrong direction, flooding houses and workshops. Therefore, in the days leading up to the flood, young men would descend into the canals with shovels and pickaxes, clearing accumulated mud and reeds. Women, on the other hand, would prepare sandbags and planks to protect house entrances during the flood. You had already cut the planks to cover your own workshop entrance and set them aside. Temple priests would be more visible during this period. They not only conducted religious ceremonies, but also made predictions about how severe the flood would be. They studied the sky and listened to news from the north. If it was said that there was heavy rainfall in the upper Euphrates region, the snow melted early in the upper regions. The rains haven't stopped, he said. This sentence created a slight silence in the market. As soon as you heard these words, you returned to your workshop and rechecked your preparations. That night, a heavy silence hung over Shuruppak. Movement in the streets had decreased. Everyone was making their final checks in their homes or workshops. Some had already started moving their goods and valuables to higher ground. Priests burned incense in the temple all night, praying to the gods for protection. You, too, climbed onto your roof and watched the dark surface of the river. Moonlight stretched across the water like a trembling silver line. At that moment, though the river seemed silent, you felt a great power slowly accumulating beneath it. And perhaps most of all that night, this question echoed within you. Will this flood pass like any other? Or will this city truly become the scene of a disaster that earns it the title, the last city before the flood? Sleep did not come easily that night in Shuruppak. A faint rumble from the river, mingling with the wind, drifted through the city's empty streets. The sound of the water was not as it usually was, it had a deeper, fuller tone. As you sat on the roof of your house, you tried to decipher the meaning of this sound. It was different from the flood sounds you had heard over the years, but perhaps it was just your mind amplifying the approaching water. With the first light of dawn, the city stirred again. When you got up early and opened your workshop door, you saw people passing in the street carrying loads, sacks of grain, water jars, bales of woven goods. Some were moving their belongings to the roofs of their houses, while others were heading towards small elevations just outside the city. Women, with their children, were sealing the entrances of houses with mud and peel. You too participated in the ceremony, closing your eyes and inhaling the scent of incense, hearing in your mind the heavy approaching footsteps of the water from afar. As evening fell, the sky turned a heavy grey, the sun's colour faded, the horizon blurred. The river was now very close to the bank. Some small canals had already started to fill with water. Children watched this scene excitedly, but the elders called them indoors. You, too, placed the planks you had prepared at your workshop door, filling the gaps with reeds and mud. When night fell, Shuruppak became silent. Only the continuous, deep sound of the river could be heard. This sound was now less a hum and more like a heavy breath. People waited in their homes. Some tried to sleep, while others sat on their roofs all night, watching the dark surface of the river. You, too, couldn't sleep. You noticed every rise of the water, every faint smell of the flood. Towards midnight, a more distinct rumble came from afar. This was not the sound of the river's normal flow. It was as if the water, along with stones and mud, was slowly rolling forward. Though you couldn't see anything in the darkness, you felt that instinctive sense that the water was very close. By morning, some of Shurupak's lower streets were under water. It wasn't deep yet, but the ankle-high water was a sign that the flood had begun. People came out into the streets to move their belongings one last time. Pottery, baskets, grain sacks, pets. Everything was hurriedly moved to higher ground. You, too, carried your last remaining jars with your neighbor to the small hill in the city. Throughout that day, the water rose slowly but steadily. First, it covered the ground floors, then the stone pavements of the courtyards. Products on the lower shelves of the potters' workshops began to sway in the water. The market square was now empty. Water ha. In a large city like Shuruppak, these laws were especially important. As the population grew, control over both resources and water became more complex. It was said that one of the law tablets contained an article like this: "Before the floodwater fills the canals, each household shall perform its allotted cleaning. Whoever neglects this duty shall pay compensation equivalent to their neighbor's damage." This was not just a regulation, it was a rule of survival. Some of the laws on clay tablets dealt with natural disasters. Provisions like, if the flood destroys the granary outside the city walls, the goods inside shall be considered common property of all the people, ensured that individual property transformed into communal benefit in times of catastrophe. Such laws might seem simple to us today, but in that era, they were a written guarantee of solidarity against the destructive power of water. Another important area of laws concerned agriculture and land use. Every year after a flood, the land was reshaped and boundaries blurred. To whom a piece of land that had shifted into a neighbor's field during a flood belonged was determined only according to the law tablets. For this reason, records of remeasurement of land boundaries were frequently found on tablets. Sometimes these measurements were made with the priests present, and the results were announced both on tablets and orally. You, too, would listen to these announcements in the village square, discerning from your neighbour's facial expressions who had gained and who had lost land. These laws were not just practical regulations. They also served as reminders of people's responsibilities to one another. For instance, the clause, "Whoever fails to protect their neighbour's animals during flood time shall give 2 of their own animals," was not merely a penalty but a necessity for solidarity. Because this might be the first written acknowledgement of the possibility of unusually high water levels at that time. If you had heard such an article, you would wonder if it was a warning or indeed a harbinger of an event yet to come. Another notable area in the law tablets concerned trade. In the pre-flood era, trade was not only an economic activity, but also the foundation of intercity relations. Agreements made in the days before the flood were sealed on tablets, and copies were kept by both parties. These copies were vital to prevent disputes after a disaster. Clauses like, "Whoever fails to deliver their goods during flood time shall give double the amount next year," provided both trust and deterrence. This entire legal system essentially aimed at one thing: increasing the chances of survival in a geography where disaster was inevitable. Laws could not change the direction of water, but they could determine how people would act in the face of disaster. As part of this order, you would know that you had a responsibility to protect the community's existence, even if it wasn't explicitly written on the tablets. And perhaps the most thought-provoking thing is that some of these tablets have survived to this day. When archaeologists, thousands of years later, hold these clay fragments and try to decipher the indentations on them, they are in fact reading the last warnings before the flood. Yet for those living in that era, these warnings were merely the shadow of an unexperienced future. As you pass through Shurupak's narrow streets, you may never have seen these tablets stored in the cool room of the administrative building, but their existence silently guided your life, because law, even unseen, is felt, and perhaps in a corner of your mind, this question would always linger. Were the things written on these tablets truly meant to prevent disaster, or merely to...
In the days before the flood, one of the most discussed sections of the law tablets concerned stock management. The clause, "Every household shall deliver 1/5 of its pre-flood food stock to the temple," ensured the creation of a communal food store. The temple pledged to distribute these stocks equally during a disaster. You too would consider this system fair, because even if individual preparations were insufficient, the community could survive together. However, this system began to be tested by rumors of an approaching great flood. News from the north reported that the rains had not stopped, the snows had melted early, and the water was already rising. At such times, some people would avoid delivering their stocks, hiding their stores under the excuse that this year the flood won't be that bad. The law forbade this, but there was no monitoring network to reach every corner of the city. Priests and city officials would occasionally raid homes to find undelivered stocks. These raids usually increased as the flood approached. Found stocks were confiscated and their owners faced fines or loss of property. If you had witnessed such a raid, you would notice the mixed expressions on people's faces: fear, shame, but also a hidden anger. Another important element in the enforcement of laws was the scribes. Scribes were not only the ones who wrote the tablets, but also those who carried the memory of the laws. Without them, it would be impossible to update the rules or announce them to the public. In the city square, on certain days before the flood, scribes would climb onto a high platform and read out new legal provisions or changes. You, too, would stand among the crowd, listening carefully to every word, because these words might determine the rules that would save or complicate your life in the coming months. Different segments of society reacted to these laws in different ways. For wealthy merchants, laws meant preventing commercial disputes and securing their goods. For farmers, these rules meant fair distribution of water and protection of land boundaries. For potters and artisans, laws were a framework that preserved the order necessary for the continuity of their work. But for everyone, there was a common truth. The law was a thin barrier built against the chaos of water and disaster. This barrier began to crack with the rumors of the approaching deluge, because the possibility of a disaster beyond ordinary floods called into question the adequacy of existing laws. The question, if the waters breach the walls, will these laws still be valid, began to be whispered in some conversations. You, too, did not know the answer to this question, for what was written on the law tablets was regulated only for known disasters. In the temple, the priest tried to reassure the people against these rumors. "The gods protect this city," a priest would say. "Our laws are under their watch." But some of the people did not find these words comforting. No matter how strong the law, it was fragile against the boundless nature of water. Some families began to make their own silent preparations. According to the laws, it was forbidden to leave the city during a flood, as this would weaken collective defense. But in the darkness of night, it was heard that a small number of people were taking their belongings and heading towards higher hills. This meant both defying the laws and leaving their neighbors behind. Although the law strictly forbade such escapes, as disaster approached, everyone was left to their own conscience. City officials began to guard the city gates to prevent escapes, but even these guards could not stop determined people seeking a safe place outside the city, because law, in moments when disaster loomed, had to contend with human instincts. You too felt this conflict. On one side, community order, on the other, the desire for personal survival. At this point, the law tablets were no longer just indentations on clay, but also articles weighed in people's consciences, and you could not know which way the scales would tip. Because perhaps the real question was, were the laws truly strong enough to stand against the water, or were they just silent words that kept us occupied until the water came? In Shurupak, the days began to grow heavy with the rising water. The order previously protected by the words of the law tablets slowly gave way to an uncertain waiting. It was as if everyone in the city continued their daily tasks, yet deep down they knew these tasks would soon become meaningless. The administrative building, where the law tablets were neatly arranged on shelves, still maintained its coolness. There, hundreds of regularly organized tablets silently awaited the articles detailing the sharing of fields after a flood, how stocks would be distributed, and when and by whom water canals would be repaired. As you passed in front of this building, you would see the guards sitting by the door. They were tasked with ensuring the physical safety of these tablets. But like everyone else, you knew that the approaching disaster would render this protection meaningless. The indentations on the tablets had witnessed countless floods up to now. Some tablets had recorded the arrival of great waters in previous centuries, followed by reconstruction, but this time what was being spoken of was not an ordinary flood. News from the north reported that the water was rising rapidly and incessantly, and that the flood would cover a much larger area than normal. In such a situation, most of the legal provisions would remain on paper, or, in this case, on clay. Nevertheless, the laws still appeared to be enforced. Officials checked food stocks in warehouses, and temple priests explained to the people that aid would only become possible by protecting communal stocks. Potters continued to seal their warehouses, and farmers prepared to move their animals to higher ground. But all this activity was, in fact, a small ceremonial resistance against the inevitable arrival of the water. Some legal provisions were very clear about maintaining order during a flood. For example, the article, "Whoever takes common food stocks without permission shall pay double the amount next year had been a deterrent until now. But now the phrase next year was filled with uncertainty because no one knew if next year would come. For this reason, some people had begun to disregard the rules. It was heard that at night some silently took grain from the warehouses. The law forbade this, but as the smell of water spread into the city, the power of this prohibition weakened. As a last resort, the priests asked for the most important articles of the tablets to be recited loudly. In the city centre, people gathered. Scribes, with clay tablets in hand, read the rules to be applied during the flood. Food sharing, water drainage routes, protection of animals. The words echoed in the square, but the same thought could be read on everyone's face. How much could these words withstand the pressure of the water? As you stood among the crowd in the square, you saw people silently looking at each other. Some were still determined to follow the rules, because this was what it meant to be human, even in times of disaster. Others had begun to prioritize their family's safety above all else. The clash of these two attitudes was outwardly silent, but carried a strong underlying tension. When the flood began, the laws were still being spoken. In the first days, as the water slowly rose, people still acted according to the rules. Only permitted amounts of food were taken from the warehouses, and canals were opened as planned. But when the water accelerated, this order broke down. People rushed to the nearest grain jar, entering their neighbour's field to save their animals. The legal provisions were lost amidst the roar of the water. Even the tablets inside the administrative building were now in danger. At one point, officials began moving the tablets to higher shelves. Some tablets were placed in clay jars, sealed, to be returned one day. But it was clear that this effort would also be limited, because when the water pressed against the walls, even the mud brick walls of the building would not hold. And indeed, within a few days, the water reached the threshold of the administrative building. Guards entered one last time to save the tablets. Some tablets were moved, while others were left in place. As you watched this scene from afar, you felt that it was not only the laws, but also the city's memory being surrendered to the water. Some of the tablets might be stored in another city, in another building. Perhaps thousands of years later they would be found beneath the earth and read again. But for that moment, the laws were no longer witnesses to a living order, but silent witnesses to a world slowly sinking. As the water rose, people no longer looked at their neighbours, but at the direction of the water. The boundaries defined by the legal provisions lost their meaning with the spread of the water. Streets, courtyards, fields, all had merged at the same level, beneath the same water. A few days later, the silence over Shurapak changed. No longer were there sounds of bartering in the market, no hum of potters' wheels, no words of scribes. There was only the heavy, ceaseless sound of the water. And as you stood in the midst of the water, this question echoed in your mind. Were the things written on these tablets truly to protect us, or merely to make us feel safe until the water came? In the days when the water engulfed the street, of Shurapak, no one imagined that the name of a single man would still be remembered thousands of years later. Yet Utnapishtim, referred to in Mesopotamian tablets as the sole survivor of the flood, became both a living witness of that era and a symbol of human memory resisting water. If you had lived in that age, you might have heard his name only in rumors from a distant city. Years later, this story would merge into epics, but its roots would still lie in real lands and beneath real waters. Utnapishtim is described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known written epics, as the person granted immortality by the gods after the flood. But behind this legend lies a much quieter, much more earthly story. This story is of a man who witnessed not only the coming of the water, but also the collapse of his own society. Before the flood, Utnapishtim lived in a coastal city. This city, like Shuruppak, was dependent on the bounty of the rivers. His life was shaped by the rhythm of the seasons, the cycle of floods, the grains he bartered with farmers, the dried fish he received from fishermen, the sturdy jars he bought from potters. These were parts of his daily life. But slowly, the language of the waters began to change. News from the north reported that the rains had not stopped for weeks, and the snows in the mountains had melted early. Normally, floods came slowly and receded within a few weeks. But this time, what was being said about the water's speed and power was different. Utnapishtim, a man who had seen floods since childhood, sensed this change. This was not just a seasonal swelling, but a sign of something much larger. What distinguished him from others was that he took these signs seriously. Most people wanted to believe that the water would recede as it always did, because the order seemed immutable. Every year the flood would come, and then life would return to normal. But Utnapishtim knew that the memory of the rivers was longer than human memory. He believed that the stories of the great water, whispered by the elders, were not just fairy tales. In legends, the gods are said to have warned him of the flood in advance. In reality, perhaps these warnings were merely the silent signs of nature. The color of the thick clouds in the sky, the wind not changing direction for days, the delay of trade caravans from the north. These were silent messages for those who paid attention. Utnapishtim's first action was to reinforce his own house and storeroom. He obtained the strongest jars from the potters, sealing their mouths with mud. He doubled his grain stocks, storing dried fish and dates. He built wooden structures to move his animals to a higher place that would be safer from flooding. But these precautions would not be enough to stop the magnitude of the water. He wanted to protect not only his own family, but also the coastal city where he lived. For this reason, he also warned his neighbors. Some listened to him and made preparations, but most scoffed, saying, "It's just the usual flood," because disaster is something that is not believed until it arrives. Behind the story of the great ship in the legends, there was probably a much smaller, much more modest reality. Utnapishtim knew the direction from which the water was coming, and bringing planks from an old timber store by the river, he began to build a large raft. This raft was not as magnificent as a legendary ship, but it was compartmentalized, high-sided, and water-resistant. Yet these preparations led him to be alone. Because as disaster approaches, human nature divides, those who want to flee and those who insist on staying. Utnapishtim understood both. Those who remained could not abandon their homes and routines. Those who left often did not know where they were going, and the water came faster than expected. The rise in the first days, still sea, made normal to people accustomed to the flood cycle. But on the fourth day, the color of the water changed. A brown and densely muddy current flowed rapidly from the river's flood branch towards the city. This was the harbinger of the great deluge from the north. Utnapishtim knew at that moment that there was no more time. He loaded his family onto the rafts he had prepared. He took only the most essential items with him: grain jars, water jugs, a few simple tools, and the small animals he could save. What they left behind were not just belongings, they were leaving an entire life, years of habits and familiar faces. At that moment, Utnapishtim's journey had begun. This was not just a water journey, but also a breaking away from the past, and when he looked back, he saw the coastal city slowly submerging, the mud brick walls dissolving, the stones of the marketplace disappearing beneath the water. But perhaps the most silent and painful sight was the administrative building of the city, with its hundreds of law tablets on stone shelves disappearing beneath the water. Because at that moment, not only people but memory itself had surrendered to the flood. And as you listen to this story, you might ask, was Utnapishtim's salvation truly a divine miracle, or merely the story of a man who knew how to read the silent signs of disaster in time? As Utnapishtim's journey swallowed weeks into months, the sound of the water had become both a background hum and a measure of time. Days began by looking at the water's color, and nights ended with its reflections. Every morning, whether the sky was clear or cloudy, the only constant was that the water still covered everything. One morning, before the sun had risen, he smelled a different scent on the water. This was distinct from the sweet and sometimes muddy smell of open water. It was the faint but clear scent of earth. Tea. His was a sign he had awaited for weeks. With the first rays of the sun, an indistinct silhouette of land emerged in the distance. Utnapishtim took his oar, gently steering against the current. The slow approach, lasting all day, culminated in setting foot on solid ground for the first time by late afternoon. This place was like a narrow area on a high hill, untouched by the flood. Around it stood a few sturdy trees and steep slopes leading down to the water. Here, for the first time in weeks, he felt earth instead of water beneath his feet. If you were to experience such a moment, you would understand how even the slightly firm texture of the earth could bring peace. They spent the night there. Dry branches for a fire were hard to find, but a small fire was lit from thick tree branches and old pieces of wood that had drifted to the hilltop. That night, the crackling of the fire mingled with the sound of water that had been heard for weeks. As the children fell asleep by the fire, Utnapishtim looked up at the sky. The stars were not like they had been during the long nights on the water. Here, on solid ground, they seemed more fixed and brighter. The next morning, he noticed the water had receded a little more. At the foot of the hill, newly exposed muddy areas began to appear. This was a sign that the water, however slowly, was withdrawing. As days passed, these muddy areas expanded and new patches of land came into view. First, rocky and root-strewn areas, then plains resembling old fields emerged. But these lands were not as they used to be. They had a thick layer of silt left by the flood. This was soil that could be fertile. However, the long period spent underwater had destroyed most of the old structures. As Utnapishtim explored the surroundings, he saw that the power of the water had swept away not only life, but also memory. Mud brick houses had completely disintegrated, and even stone foundations had shifted from their places. Sometimes he would find a piece of pottery, a seal, a fragment of a broken tablet in the mud. These pieces were silent reminders that people had once lived, worked, and traded. But this reminder was silent, because none of those who made and used them were left. If such a piece came into your hands, even without knowing its story, you would feel its weight. As the waters receded, he could travel further. First, small islets connected, then river branches began to reappear. But these branches were no longer as familiar as before. Some had completely changed direction, others had widened more than ever. The flood had altered not only the city, but the geography itself. Utnapishtim also began to encounter other survivors. At first a few people, then small groups. Each had come from a different place, carrying a story of different losses. Some had lost their families in the water, others had escaped with only a few belongings. But what they all had in common was the same distant look in their eyes. This look carried both the salvation and the burden of those left behind. In the new lands, a silent agreement formed among the survivors. First shelter, then food. Clay for mud brick walls was still abundant, but it took time to dry, so the first shelters were made of branches, reeds, and stones. Grain stocks were limited, so meals were shared. Utnapishtim did not hesitate to share his own stocks. For one who had seen the magnitude of the disaster, the meaning of possessions was now different. As days passed, a new order slowly began to take shape. People made small plantings in the fertile mud left by the flood. Fishing became one of the first food sources, because even though the waters had receded, the remaining pools were full of fish. Pottery making restarted, because vessels were needed to store food and water, but this time the pottery was simpler, more functional than before. Utnapishtim, over time, transformed from a man on a journey into the wise elder of the new settlement. His memory connected the before and after of the disaster. Children would ask him when the water would come, how to prepare, and he would teach them to understand the language of the water, to watch the sky, to read the signs of the wind and clouds. For the most important thing he had learned was that disaster could always return. And as years passed, Utnapishtim's story, just like the earlier stories of great waters, turned into a legend. His name was no longer just the name of a man, it was a symbol of salvation from disaster, of understanding the signs of water in time. But legends do not always fully convey the truth. The truth is hidden in quieter, smaller details, a handprint in a piece of mud, a seal on a piece of pottery, the arrangement of stones left by the water. These are the things that do not enter epics but carry the true memory. And perhaps you, listening to this story, would ask, was Utnapishtim truly the only survivor, or merely the one who lasted longest in memory? Before the flood, what kept the pulse of life in Mesopotamia was not only the rhythm of the rivers flooding, but also the continuity of the produce from these lands. Among these products, too, stood at the center not just of tables, but of social order, trade, and even belief, barley and dates. If you had lived in that era, no matter what month of the year it was, these two foods would be a part of your life. In your morning breakfast, your lunch, your evening meal, your market purchases, and the religious ceremonies held in the temple. Barley and dates were not just foods that filled bellies, but silent pillars that ensured the continuity of a civilization. Mesopotamia's hot summers and sometimes salty soil structure forced farmers to be selective. The crop best adapted to these conditions was, without a doubt, barley. Wheat was also cultivated, of course, but wheat was more delicate. It was less resistant to salt and drought. Barley, however, could take root even in soil that rapidly lost its moisture after a flood and matured quickly. This characteristic was vitally important, especially in years when the flood receded late, shortening the planting season. Planting time began with the retreat of the rivers. The alluvium left behind by the waters formed the fine-grained, nutritious soil that barley loved. Farmers, using wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, would lightly scratch the surface to aerate the soil. Seeds were scattered into these shallow furrows, then lightly pressed down. Everything was simple, but this simplicity was sufficient because the post-flood soil was already rich in nutrients. Barley cultivation did not require much water during its growing period. This was a great advantage in a geography where the arrival of water was never fully known. Nevertheless, especially during dry periods, small irrigation canals were opened, directing water from the river to the fields. This work required communal effort in the village because the canals served not just one field, but the cultivated areas of the entire village. You, too, on such an irrigation day, would see everyone working with shovels and pickaxes, with women and children checking the direction of the water. When harvest time arrived, the golden colour of barley ears covering the fields was one of the year's most magnificent sights. Harvesting was done with sickles. The ears were gathered and separated from their stalks in the threshing area. Wooden sledges pulled by oxen were commonly used for threshing, with sharp stone fragments placed beneath these sledges to break the ears and separate the grains. The barley grains were then filled into large baskets and thoroughly dried in the sun. Drying was crucial to reduce the risk of mould. The dried grains were placed into large clay jars, their mouths sealed with mud to prevent air exposure. These jars were stored in both homes and temple granaries. The stocks in temple granaries were a safeguard for the community because in times of famine or crop loss after a flood, these stocks would be distributed to the people. Dates were the other pillar of life in Mesopotamia. Date palms grew along riverbanks, in areas where their roots could reach groundwater. Their trunks were long, branches sparse, and leaves tough. Thanks to these characteristics, they could withstand floods. Date palm maintenance continued throughout the year. Buds opened in spring, fruits began to ripen in summer, and by autumn they reached their sweetest state. Fresh dates were consumed daily, but dried dates were the most valuable. The drying process was simple. After being picked from the branches, dates were laid out on reed mats and left under the sun for days. Dried dates hardened, their sugar concentrated, allowing them to be stored for months without spoiling. Dried dates were also indispensable for long-distance merchants, as they were both light and provided high energy. Date syrup was used as both a sweetener and an energy source. This syrup was spread on barley bread and used to flavour some dishes. In temple kitchens, bread sweetened with date syrup were among the primary offerings presented to the gods. Barley and dates were not only food but also the backbone of Mesopotamia's economy. In marketplaces, sacks of barley and baskets of dates were exchanged for pottery, textiles, and copper tools. In some regions, barley grains were used directly as currency. A certain measure was considered equivalent to a certain good. When you entered such a market, you would see vendors carefully weighing barley measures and moving date baskets into the shade. These two products also guided the social structure of the community. Barley bread and dates were central to tables during weddings, festivals, and religious ceremonies. The first thing offered to a guest was usually dates, followed by barley porridge or bread. However, this food chain was fragile. When the flood came too harshly, barley fields would be submerged in mud, and the roots of date palms could rot. When the flood was weak, the soil would remain parched, and crops would wither. For this reason, when rumours of the flood spread, one of the first anxieties in people's minds was the fate of barley and dates. Because they were not just foods that satisfied hunger, but also the continuation of life itself. And in such times, the same question would always echo in people's minds. If the flood truly swallows all fields and date groves, what seeds will remain to restart life? The journey of barley and dates in pre-flood society was a long chain, beginning in the field and ending in storerooms, markets, or on tables. Every link in this chain silently shaped people's daily lives. If you had lived in that era, you could have witnessed almost every stage of this chain, because agriculture was not just a concern for farmers, but a communal matter for the entire society. The planting of barley began immediately after the floodwaters receded. First, the soil needed to dry sufficiently to be entered. If entered too early, the soil would remain muddy, making planting difficult. If entered too late, moisture would decrease, and seeds could dry out before germinating. For this reason, the most experienced farmers in the village decided when to enter the field. They determined this time by looking at the soil's texture and smell. During planting, the division of labour was clear. Men drove ploughs with oxen, while women and children scattered seeds. In some families, a small area was set aside at the edge of the field, and only barley for seed was planted there. This area was seen as a guarantee for the next year, because even if there was a flood or a bad harvest, the barley grown here would be saved for new planting. Date production had a different rhythm. Date palms required year-round care. In spring, when buds opened, dried leaves between the branches were cleaned. In early summer, as fruits began to ripen, branches were supported. When harvest time came, men climbed the trees with long ladders, while women and children collected the dates that fell to the ground. The harvested fruits were sorted by type. Those to be consumed fresh immediately went to the market, while those to be dried were laid out on reed mats under the sun for days. Storage was one of the most critical stages in the journey of these two products. Barley was stored in large clay jars, their mouths sealed with mud. These jars were kept in the coolest corners of houses or in temple granaries to protect them from moisture. Dates were usually stored in baskets or clay jars. Dried dates, being able to last for months, were an indispensable food during the winter months. Temple granaries were the community's point of security. In these granaries, products collected before and after the flood each year were recorded and distributed to the public when needed. Temple officials counted sacks of barley and sealed baskets of dates. These seals guaranteed that the products were not taken without permission. You, too, seeing a seal on a date basket in the marketplace, would understand that it came from the temple granary. Trade routes carried the influence of barley and dates beyond city limits in Mesopotamia. Sacks of barley were transported up and down rivers by boats. Dates, especially in dried form, were sent to distant cities. This trade both strengthened intercity ties and allowed the exchange of products from different regions, making societies interdependent. In the final years, as rumors of the flood began to spread, there was a change in these trade routes as well. Some merchants, unwilling to take risks, stopped long journeys. Products in warehouses began to be checked more frequently. The temple secured the products received from the people, but distributed them more carefully, because the coming of the water and how long it would stay was now a greater uncertainty. The last harvests before the flood took place in a different atmosphere. Normally, harvest time was celebrated with festivities and communal meals, but this time joy and apprehension were intertwined. As people harvested their crops, they also watched the sky, tracking the direction and color of the clouds. The harvested barley was dried faster than usual, and dates were collected and stored more quickly. During this period, a silent movement prevailed in villages and cities. Everyone tried to build sufficient stocks for their own family, while the temple completed security stocks for the community. Prices in the marketplaces had changed. Date baskets and barley sacks were more valuable than before. Some people preferred to store their products rather than sell them, which led to a slowdown in trade. And perhaps the most striking change occurred in how people viewed these products. Barley and dates were no longer just daily foods, but also symbols of hope in the uncertainty of the future. Every sack of barley, every basket of dates offered a small sense of security against the approaching disaster. If you had lived in those days, you would examine every bag you stored with your hands, check if every date basket was sturdy, and perhaps ask yourself, how long can these stocks keep us alive? The rumors of the flood were no longer just whispers in the marketplace. The sound of the water, the direction of the wind, the darkening clouds in the sky, all concretized these rumors. Barley fields and date groves had been harvested earlier than expected, with the thought of the floods coming. The harvested products were quickly dried and placed in the safest parts of the storerooms. Everyone was trying to protect both their own families and the community's stocks. But when the water came, it became clear that no preparation was entirely sufficient. In the first days, the slow widening of the river branches had only swallowed the soil at the edges of the fields. But as the water rose, field boundaries blurred. Golden barley ears were replaced by a brown, murky current. Some farmers tried to hurriedly gather unthreshed barley bundles, but within a few days these attempts became impossible. Date groves, however, were more resilient. Thanks to their tall trunks, they stood tall in the first days of the flood. But as the flood continued, their roots remained submerged in mud for a long time, leading to the decay of some trees. Unripe dates broke from their branches and drifted on the water. Some people tried to collect these dates with rafts or simple boats, but these were only small quantities. The situation of the storerooms was more complex. Temple storerooms were built on the highest points of the city, which initially kept them safe. However, when the water did not recede for weeks and the current changed direction, even these high points became threatened. The walls of some storerooms softened under the constant moisture. Mud bricks dislodged one by one. The barley sacks inside swelled and spoiled as water seeped in. Nevertheless, some storerooms were miraculously saved. These were usually buildings built on more solid stone foundations with high entrances, and the clay jars inside, being sealed with mud, were able to withstand water for a long time. Some of these jars were still usable when opened in the post-flood era. The fate of individual stocks, however, was more dependent on luck. Some jars placed in the corners of houses were saved in areas where the water rose slowly, but most overturned as walls collapsed and their contents mingled with the water. The water took away not only food, but also an entire year's labor with it. In those days, when you saw a date basket or a sack of barley floating on the water, you would feel that it was not just food, but also a lost way of life. For the survivors, the remaining food was no longer a luxury of the past, but a guarantee of the future. Barley was consumed both as bread and as porridge. In the post-flood period, since clean water sources were difficult to access, barley porridge was sometimes cooked with date syrup instead of water. This provided both taste and energy. Dates were consumed fresh and also dried in the sun for future days. However, stocks were limited, and access was not equal for everyone. Food from temple storerooms was first distributed to the elderly, children, and the sick. Those able to work participated in reconstruction efforts in exchange for food. This became both a collaboration and a necessity in post-flood society. In such an environment, you would see that working for days in exchange for a bag of barley could become the new normal of life. In the post-flood era, barley and dates became not only food, but also tools that enabled the restart of trade. The first exchanges were made with these two products. A basket of dates was exchanged for a clay, pot of water, or a small fish. Barley, especially because it was needed for seeds, was even more valuable. A handful of barley seeds could mean a new harvest a few months later. During this period, more creative methods were developed to preserve food. Barley grains were placed in waterproof bags and hung from high branches. Dates were placed in more durable baskets and hidden in rock crevices untouched by the flood. These methods showed how deep the fear of the water rising again was. The symbolic meaning of barley and dates also changed after the flood. Before, these products were ordinary parts of bounty and daily life. But after the disaster, even a single date became a small sign that life could continue. Children born after the flood were given names meaning barley or date. This symbolized both the loss experienced and the hope for survival. Over time, the last remaining foods from pre-flood stocks were consumed. New plantings were made, but the post-flood structure of the soil had changed. Some areas had become more fertile, while others had become salty and unsuitable for production. Some of the date palms had been completely destroyed, but those sprouting from their roots carried the hope of renewed growth. And even years later, the elders who remembered the flood when telling the story of barley and dates to children conveyed it not just as a food story, but as a survival story, because these two products, while an ordinary part of life before the disaster, had become life itself after the disaster. Perhaps that is why the same question echoed in the minds of everyone who survived that period. If great waters come again one day, will the seeds in our hands be enough to bring us back to life? In pre-flood Mesopotamia, one of the ways to understand the timing of the river's floods, the arrival of seasons and the periods of planting and harvest, was to look at the sky. The connection between land, water and sky was a silent truth in the minds of everyone living in these lands. But those who best understood the language of the sky were a special group known among the people as observers. These were priests who, on the high terraces of temples or the uppermost floors of ziggurats, watched the sky for days, weeks, even years. If you had lived in that era, you might have seen the flickering light of a small oil lamp at the top of a temple tower in the darkness of night, knowing that an observer was silently at work there. These observers did not just look at the sky, they also inscribed what they saw onto clay tablets in cuneiform. Every observation date, the position of the moon, the arrangement of the stars, the brightness of the planets, even the color of the clouds, was meticulously recorded. For them, the sky was not just an aesthetic view, but a message sent by the gods to the world. Sky tablets were systematic records of these observations. Each tablet would begin with the date of the day, followed by a description of the sky on that day, and finally, the probable interpretation was written. For example, today the moon appeared red on the western horizon. Clouds came from the north. This is a sign that the flood will come earlier than expected. Such records were not only scientific observations, but also the first lines of a prophecy. The work of the observers directly influenced the daily life of the community. Planting time, harvest day, and even the dates of some religious ceremonies were determined according to the signs taken from the sky. If the moon was in a certain position and clouds unexpectedly gathered, it could mean that the rains would begin soon. At such times, farmers would rush to their fields and merchants would move their goods into their storerooms. But sky tablets were not just about agriculture and trade. They were also used to predict disasters in advance. In the years before the flood, observers had begun to record some unusual phenomena. Lunar eclipse durations had lengthened, some stars had been seen at unexpected times, and unusual colors had appeared on the horizon. These records were initially discussed only in the temples, but over time this news began to be whispered in city squares. You too, when you went to the market, might have overheard vendors bending over their stalls, telling each other, "The priests say the water will be very high this year." Observers not only looked at the sky, but also compared their observations with past records. Similar events recorded in old tablets were placed side by side with new observations. If the moon had been seen in the same position 1,000 years ago, and a great flood had followed, this was considered a serious warning for the people of today. For this reason, the observers' rooms contained shelves full of old tablets. Their task was to read these tablets, understand them, and find clues about the future. These studies did not always yield definitive results. The sky could sometimes mislead. A change in cloud direction, an unexpected shift in the wind, could delay a previously predicted event. For this reason, observers were cautious in their interpretations. Nevertheless, some records with prophetic significance became deeply ingrained in the public's mind. In the final months before the flood, some records entered into the sky tablets were unusual. Observers had noted that the moon appeared unusually red for several consecutive nights, and some stars had dimmed at unexpected times. They also wrote that a dense layer of grey clouds that appeared on the northern horizon immediately after sunset had not dissipated for weeks. This was a very rare occurrence, see in old tablets, and historically, such a sign was recorded to be followed by great floods. The priests discussed this information behind closed doors first. They believed preparations should be made without causing public panic, but some observers thought that remaining silent was wrong. They said, if the water is truly coming high, everyone must know and act accordingly. Thus, some information slowly began to spread. The activity in the city also changed with these rumors. Merchants began moving their warehouses from the riverbank to higher areas. Farmers hastened their planting in the fields. Officials in the temple granaries began checking food stocks and replenishing shortages. On such days you would have seen market shopping accelerate, with date baskets and barley sacks selling earlier. One of the most important tools of the observers was the simple but effective methods they used to examine the night sky. On the uppermost floors of the ziggurats, there were observation points facing the 4 cardinal directions. From here, the entire horizon could be seen, and the movement of the moon and stars could be clearly followed. Observers sometimes used ropes, sometimes stone markers, and sometimes the reflection in water-filled bowls to measure the sky. Water was surprisingly effective in reflecting the positions of stars and detecting small movements. Sky tablets were not just records, they were also memory. Each new tablet added to the knowledge of previous generations, strengthening the link between past and future. For this reason, observers saw themselves as a link in a chain that protected not only the present, but also the future. But in the days before the flood, it was clear that this chain was under strain. The observers knew that the signs they saw were not ordinary. In their gaze, the sky no longer carried just the flow of time, but the harbinger of a great change to come. And perhaps the question they asked most was, while the sky speaks so clearly to us, are we truly listening enough to understand it? As the final weeks before the flood began, observers ascended to the uppermost floor of the temple towers more frequently than ever. The sky had been giving unusual signs for days. The moon changed its hue from night to night, sometimes appearing with a dull greyish light, sometimes with a deep red glow. Some stars appeared in positions normally unseen during this season, then quickly vanished. The observers not only watched these changes with their eyes, but meticulously inscribed them onto their tablets. Each record began with the date, followed by the observed event, and finally the interpretation. Notes like, "The moon is red on the western horizon, the north wind blew in the same direction for 2 consecutive nights, daytime clouds did not disperse before evening," were interpreted by comparing them with past great disasters. These observations were not just technical information. Every line held a clue about the fate of the people. But to what extent this information would be relayed to the public was discussed at length in temple councils. Some priests argued that causing panic among the people would disrupt order. Others said that people needed to know the truth to prepare. As you walked through the market at that time, you might have heard merchants whispering, "The priests are speaking differently this time." One of the most striking signs recorded in the sky tablets was a broad grey band appearing on the northern horizon after sunset. This band did not disappear for weeks, and a faint light from beneath the clouds subtly reflected into the night sky. Old tablets recorded that great waters followed such a sight. The day the observers saw this sign, an extraordinary meeting was held in the temple. Priests opened traditio, Nol prophecy texts. They read aloud lines describing ancient disasters. A heavy silence permeated the temple during these readings. Afterwards, preparations began to make offerings to the gods. Fresh barley porridge, baskets of dates, fish and lamb meat were brought to the temple courtyard. These foods were not only to be offered to the gods, but also to show that the people were gathered in unity. If you had been there, you would have seen the smoke of incense rising in a thin column towards the sky, drums playing at slow rhythms, and people bowing their heads in prayer. These ceremonies were not just religious rituals, they were also a silent form of communication, etching the observers' prophecies into the minds of the people. The public associated the priests' extensive preparations with the signs seen in the sky, but most did not articulate it aloud, because in such times even words felt heavy. As observers watched the sky, they were not content with just the stars and moon. During the day, the shape of the clouds, the direction of the wind, and the colors of the sunset were also carefully recorded. In recent weeks, especially at sunset, the redness of the horizon had begun to last much longer. This redness sometimes turned into a dark, watery color, leaving thoughtful expressions on the faces of the observers. As time progressed, preparations in the city accelerated. Food stocks in warehouses were reviewed, final maintenance on canals was done, and goods were moved to higher ground. Although all this was officially described as precautionary measures, the people sensed the truth. On some nights, the observers would speak to the people from the top of the temple tower. These speeches were usually short, without technical details, but the seriousness in the observer's tone conveyed more than words. "The sky is not silent," they would sometimes say. This sentence was interpreted in different ways among the people. For some, the gods were warning; for others, these were merely nature's own signs. In the last days before the flood, the lines written in the sky tablets became increasingly short and intense. The moon remained on the same trajectory for 3 nights. The grey band on the northern horizon widened. Redness was seen on the western side at sunrise. Such lines had been rarely seen in the past, and each suggested being on the verge of great changes, and perhaps most striking was the change in the observer's gaze. They were the ones who best knew the language of the sky, and they now sensed that this language was telling a single story. But how that story would end, no sky tablet fully revealed. As the final weeks approached, the sky over Shuruppak seemed to carry a new message almost every day. Observers ascended the narrow stone stairs to the ziggurat's highest level more frequently than ever, taking measurements 4 times a day: morning, noon, evening, and night. In their hands were thin reed styluses, soft clay tablets, and copies of previous observation records. Each new observation was compared with past events, searching for possible similarities. The moon, for the past 7 nights, had appeared unusually large. Its reddish hue when near the horizon drew the attention not only of the observers, but also of the populace. Normally, such color changes were attributed to seasonal dust clouds, but this time the redness in the sky lingered much longer. On some nights, a thin halo of light formed around the moon, remaining suspended in the sky with a hazy glow. The observers recorded this phenomenon on their tablets as follows. This month, with the north wind, the moon appeared red for 7 nights. A halo of light formed around it. In previous recall, RDS, this sign is a harbinger of great waters from the north. The arrangement of the stars also seemed to have changed. Some constellations appeared several days earlier than they should, while others were delayed. These small shifts would go unnoticed by ordinary eyes, but for the observers, this was a sign of an imbalance in the sky's equilibrium. Daytime observations were also unusual. The appearance of redness on the western horizon at sunrise was normally very rare. In recent days, this had recurred several times. The clouds had also changed. They were now heavier, at a lower altitude, and moving in thicker layers. The wind direction changed twice a day, indicating the instability of the weather. These signs were discussed at length in meetings held in the temple. Priests and observers once again debated how much the public should know. Ultimately, it was decided that the possibility of disaster could not be entirely concealed, but these warnings would be delivered in the language of probability, not certainty. This was an attempt to prevent panic. Following this decision, a grand ceremony was prepared in the temple courtyard. The people offered sacrifices to the gods amidst the smoke of incense. Barley porridge, date syrup, and fresh fish were placed on the stone altars. The observers remained silent throughout the ceremony. Their eyes frequently drifted to the sky beyond the temple walls. If you had been there, you would have noticed the rhythm of the drums was slow but steady, and the expressions on people's faces carried both submission and apprehension. For the last 3 days, the observers' record books became more condensed. Each line conveyed the feeling that disaster was drawing closer. Before sunrise, the grey band on the northern horizon widened. The moon is setting faster than normal. The stars appear to flicker with the change in wind. The people did not directly see these records, but they noticed the changes in the sky with their own eyes. Evening markets closed earlier now, and merchants hurried to move their goods to higher ground. Farmers quickly threshed their last remaining grains, and large baskets were placed under the date palms. On the last night, the sky was unusually clear and bright. The moon, almost the size of a full moon, hung like a red orb. The stars seemed dimmer than usual, as if the moon's light had pushed them into the background. The grey band in the north no longer covered just the horizon, but 1/3 of the sky. This was a breadth the observers had not seen in records before. Atop the ziggurat, 4 observers kept watch. Each looked in a different direction, whispering what they saw to the scribe in the middle. Tablets were rapidly filled, but the expressions on the scribes' faces reflected the weight of the words being written. At one point, the oldest observer put down his stylus and gazed at the sky for a long time. Then he said quietly, "This is an irreversible sign." When morning came, the north wind unexpectedly intensified. A thin layer of mist appeared on the western side as the sun rose. By noon, the water level along the riverbank began to rise noticeably. The people initially thought this was the start of an ordinary flood, but the observers understood from the speed and color of the current that this was different. That afternoon became the last complete record written on the sky tablets: redness on the western horizon at sunrise, north wind ceaseless. Water level rose a man's height by midday. Grey band advanced south. Signs are complete. In the late afternoon, as the water began to reach the city, the observers were forced to leave the ziggurat. Some of the tablets were placed on high shelves for safekeeping, but no one knew how high the water would rise. And the next morning, the silence of the observation rooms was filled not by the observers, but by the sound of the water. The sky tablets remained unfinished, but their final lines would be read, thousands of years later, as silent witnesses to the disaster. Perhaps that is why, in the minds of everyone who survived that period, this question lingered. How much did the sky tell us, and how much were we able to understand? In the final weeks before the flood, something had begun to change in Shurupak and the surrounding villages. This change was not news spoken loudly in the marketplace or a proclamation announced in the temple square. On the contrary, it progressed so slowly as to be almost imperceptible, so quietly as to be almost inaudible. People, especially those living near the riverbank, began to abandon their homes one by one, in 2s and 3s. If you were walking on one of the dirt roads by the river at that time, you might sometimes encounter a caravan of laden donkeys, and among their burdens you would see sacks of grain, clay jars, and children sitting calmly in baskets. These departures were not openly called migrations. No one said, "We are leaving the city." Their words still held excuses like, "We are going to visit a relative," or "We need to check on the high fields for a few days." But the weight of their burdens indicated that the journey would not be short. Most of those migrating were people who knew the language of the water well. Old fishermen living by the river could recognize the smell of the flood in the air. Some farmers noticed the slightest change in the soil's texture. For them, a shift in the direction of the north wind or an increase in the river's turbidity was a silent warning about the coming weeks. The first step in these silent migrations was the transportation of food stocks, sacks of barley, baskets of dates, jars of dried fish. All were slowly carried out through the back doors of houses and loaded onto pack animals. At night, without attracting attention, these loads were moved through small paths outside the city walls. These paths, normally used by trade caravans or villagers, had now become routes for those seeking to escape disaster. Those who left generally headed towards small hills in the northeast or to elevated villages far from the river. These places were rarely submerged during flood periods. Some families had relatives in these regions, while others simply hoped to find empty land there. The journeys were not fast but cautious. They stopped frequently, so pack animals wouldn't tire, and children rested in shady areas. Those who remained in the city noticed this silent movement but did not speak about it openly. Because such a migration was not welcomed by written laws, abandoning the city during a flood meant weakening the collective defense plan. But people's instinct to protect their own families sometimes overshadowed these laws. You, in those days, would have seen the dilemma on the faces of the guards standing at the city gates. On one hand, to do their duty, on the other, to understand why people were fleeing. Although temple authorities organized ceremonies to calm the people, they did not openly intervene to stop these migrations. Perhaps they too knew that the signs they saw in the sky and the river justified this movement. Nevertheless, in official records, these departures were referred to as seasonal travel. Those migrating left very little behind. Houses stood empty, doors locked. Water jars in courtyards were emptied, and valuable possessions were taken with them. Fields were generally abandoned to their fate, because no one knew how long this journey would last. Some thought they would only be away for a few weeks. Others believed they would never return. And so the roads along Shurupak's riverbank began to fill with small, silently flowing caravans of migrants. There was no sound of drums, no farewell ceremonies, only the silence of feet treading the earth, of animals slowly moving away, and sometimes of people looking back. Perhaps the most striking thing was how unnoticed these departures were, because sometimes the greatest changes begin in the quietest moments, and these silent escapes had begun long before the flood arrived. The journey of the caravans leaving the riverbank did not start like a hurried flight. Their steps were slow because the pack animals were laden with heavy sacks and baskets. Furthermore, this journey was a test not only of belongings but also of people's endurance. Those leaving wanted to reach a safe place before the flood began, but this did not mean they would rush headlong. Every step was both a physical and mental calculation. How far could they go? How long could they stay at each stop? Which items were indispensable and which could be left behind on the way? The first stops were usually small villages far from the river, but still in low-lying areas. These villages were where the migrants took their first breaths, drank water, and rested their children. In some villages, there would still be people working in the fields. They would look at those leaving carefully, but often remained silent. Perhaps they had chosen to stay, or perhaps they still believed the river wouldn't flood excessively this year. During every break, the migrants would check their loads, sacks of barley, baskets of dates, jars of dried fish. These foods were necessary for the journey to continue. The loads were kept in the shade to prevent them from overheating in the sun. Children gathered energy by eating dates, while adults satisfied their hunger. with barley porridge. In the days that followed, the journey became more difficult. The plains along the riverbank gave way to slight elevations. The steps of the pack animals slowed, and sometimes a donkey's load would be split in two and distributed among other animals. This further slowed their progress, but safe transport of the load was paramount. Besides the physical hardships, the psychological burden of the journey was also heavy. Every kilometre pushed the memories of the life left behind a little further away. People thought of their house courtyards, their fields, their neighbours. Children asked about friends left behind, whispering, "Will we go back?" It was difficult to give a definitive answer to this question, because no one knew what the future would bring. On some nights, caravans would stop in small groups. Lighting a fire was not always possible, as wood was scarce. Most often they subsisted on dried dates and barley porridge. At night, a deep hum from the distant river could be heard. This sound was both terrifying and strangely familiar. Sometimes, carried by the wind, this hum would blend into people's sleep, like a lullaby recalling the past. Throughout the journey, different migrant caravans would occasionally meet. These encounters were brief. Each group proceeded at its own pace. But in such moments, brief greetings, exchanges of food, or sharing locations of water sources would occur. These acts of assistance were the most humane moments of the journey. On some routes, traces of old stone roads could be seen. These roads, once used by trade caravans, were now paths where those fleeing disaster sought refuge. Along the roadside were old abandoned huts, empty granaries. These structures bore the marks of people who once lived there, but now they could only serve as temporary shelters for the migrants. The caravan's aim was to reach areas as high as possible. These elevated areas would generally be safe during a flood, but since everyone wanted to go to the same places, resources there were limited. Therefore, some groups targeted less-known hills and rocky regions. These places might be less fertile, but the probability of safety was high. Mid-journey, the migrants would begin to feel less of the humid air from the river. This meant moving away from the sound and smell of the water, but it also meant stepping into an unknown geography. The familiar river landscape gave way to piles of stones and earth. This change was a relief for some, but a source of foreign fear for others. And at every new stop, people would ask the same question: should we stay here, or should we go even further? This decision was often made based on the speed of the water's rise, the state of food stocks, and the safety of the path. The journey would continue for days. Over time, the silence in the caravan would deepen even further. The conversations, shared memories, and future plans of the first days gave way to long silences. Only the rhythm of footsteps, the soft grunts of pack animals, and the sound of the wind remained. Thus, the silent escapes that began from the riverbank ended in distant hills, rocky valleys, sometimes in small forest clearings. But the end of the journey did not mean the end of uncertainty, because the questions left behind would follow them even in the new lands. And perhaps the same thought echoed in everyone's mind. As the river swallowed the homes we left behind, have we truly been saved? Or have we merely gained a little more time? The destinations reached at the end of the journeys were usually narrow plains protected by high hills or rocky ridges. These areas were high enough to be beyond the reach of floodwaters, but they were also more exposed to wind and cold. When migrant caravans arrived there, the task was to seek shelter or reinforce existing natural shelters. Recesses in rocks, clumps of bushes that broke the wind, or small abandoned stone structures were vital in the first days. Among the arrivals were people from different villages and cities. Everyone came from a different past, but the one thing that brought them together was the same: the inevitable rise of the water. In the first days, these different groups gathered around their own families, not mingling much with each other. However, the necessity of sharing food and water eventually led to a silent cooperation among the groups. Temple officials and priests also arrived with some caravans. They carried with them the sacred objects, small tablets, and seals they could bring. These items, symbols of pre-flood life, not only held religious significance in the new settlement, but also served as reminders of the old order. If you saw people gathered around these items, you would realize that they were not just praying, but also trying to preserve memories. Life in the settlements was directly built on survival. First, food stocks were counted. The sacks of barley, baskets of dates, and jars of dried fish brought by each family were collected in a central area and recorded. Temple officials established a simple system to ensure fair distribution of these stocks. Food was portioned according to age, family size, and working capacity. Water continued to be a problem even during the flood period. There were small streams flowing in the high regions, but these were insufficient. Some families used the large water jars they brought to collect rainwater. When it rained, everyone would go outside, collecting drops with the containers in their hands. In the first weeks, shelter was the most difficult issue. Most families built small huts from stone and mud. These huts were simple, single-room structures, but they were enough to cut the cold wind and allow people to spend the night dry. Over time, families cleared small areas around their huts, building walls woven from bushes. This provided both privacy and a sense of security. As days passed, the landscape on the horizon changed. In the distance, the lands along the riverbank were now completely covered with water. Only the uppermost parts of Shurupak's high buildings could be seen. Occasionally, the collapse of mud brick walls and large pieces being carried away by the current could be made out from afar. This sight created a deep silence in the new settlements. No one spoke loudly, merely shaking their heads as they looked at the water. Children quickly learned the rules of this new life. The days they played by the river were gone. Now they played hide-and-seek on small hills, among the bushes, and sometimes helped their families carry food or wood. For them, the old life had already begun to turn into a fairy tale. Among the adults, habits from the past took different forms in the new order. Potters began to make new vessels using stone and clay. Fishermen made dangerous descents to reach the water, but most often returned with small catches. Farmers searched for small patches of land where they could use the mud left by the flood. Temple priests continued to observe the sky at night. The observation tablets from before the flood had been carried to these high regions. Now, new observations were compared with old records, searching for clues about when the water would recede. But this time, the sky no longer spoke the language of disaster, but of waiting. Waiting was the hardest test in the new settlements. Days passed in similar routines: morning food sharing, midday shelter reinforcement work, evening checks of the water level by looking at the horizon. Some days the water was noticed to have receded a little in the distance, only to be seen rising again the next day. The fluctuations created both hope and disappointment. Months later, the water slowly began to recede. First, small patches of land appeared on the horizon. Then, river branches began to return to their old beds. But most of Shurupak was gone. The foundations of the temples were submerged. The stone pavements of the marketplace were shattered. Houses were razed to the ground. Those living in the new settlements began to debate whether to return to the riverbank. Some argued that it was necessary to rebuild because the river was the source of bounty. Others, however, believed that if such a great disaster had occurred once, it could happen again, and preferred to stay away. Eventually, returns began in small groups, but those who returned found a completely different landscape in place of the old city. Instead of mud brick houses, there were irregular islets shaped by the water, moss-covered stones, and a wide, silently flowing river. In place of the old market were wooden jetties providing shelter for fishermen, and in place of the temple, only scattered stone blocks rising within the water remained. Those who remained in the high regions decided to leave their old lives completely behind. They continued farming, trading, and sky observations in the new lands. But every year, at the time the water rose, their eyes involuntarily turned to the horizon. Because once a flood had been experienced, its memory remained permanent. And so the silent escapes that began from the riverbank transformed into a thin line between two settlements in the memory of a civilization, one, the old city submerged under the water, the other, the new life established in the hills. The greatest legacy that remained was the silence of this migration, neither a written epic nor a loud lament, just a question echoing in people's minds. When disaster comes, do those who notice it early truly escape, or do they just get caught a little later?